that you were below minimums. I elected then to refile for San Martin, my original destination, which I did.
Contrary to the information Captain DeWitt says he was given, the weather is terrible. He attempts to land the plane anyway, burning massive quantities of fuel in the process.
Visibility was poor, it was raining, and because of those conditions, he had to stay in closer to the airport with the runway than he would normally have liked to have done. So the first attempt was unsuccessful.
So I lined it up with the runway, and I took my second circular round.
Now on the second attempt, the winds were starting to shift, and he was unable to line it up for a landing. So he decided to go around again. On the third attempt, the same conditions existed. However, by now, the winds had shifted 180 degrees. Now he had a tailwind. Because he had a tailwind, he was too high on the approach.
So at that point, I told my crew, tell the tower I'm going to my alternate.
Calculations showed that they would make it just barely. They were legal by their calculations, but there wasn't much extra. In hindsight, it's easy to sit and say, well, they should have stopped in Bermuda or they should have stopped on the way down in San Juan. The moment that they missed the runway, it went from fuel critical to a full fuel emergency.
The bad weather, low visibility, and lack of fuel mean Captain Ballsy DeWitt has no choice but to ditch his plane in the Caribbean Sea. No footage exists of this incident, but this animation shows what the plane might have looked like as it slammed into those turbulent waters. Here's how the pilot describes what it felt like to be in the cockpit at that life and death moment.
My first contact with the water was quite smooth, and it wasn't too long after that the rest of the airplane was starting to make contact with the water and starting to get heavy drag, that an extreme amount of vibration in the cockpit. The instrument panel was vibrating so that I couldn't even read it.
But how did this flight end up in such a dire situation? After failing to land at St. Martin's Juliana Airport in bad weather, Captain DeWitt decides to divert, first to the nearby island of St. Thomas, then to St. Croix, when he realizes it's even closer. But as the plane is climbing away from the airport in a torrential downpour, there's a problem.
My navigator said to me, Ballsy, my God, look at the fuel gauges.
Because of the wind, the turbulence, and the conditions, the airplane was rocking back and forth as it was climbing. The fuel totalizer was spinning.
I told him not to worry about it because I considered it was probably being low on fuel to begin with, these turbulence is sloshing up and down the tanks might cause this.
But at 7,000 feet, warning lights indicating low fuel pressure illuminate, and Captain DeWitt knows just how grave this situation has become.
He talks to the controller, how far are we from St. Thomas? I got 5 minutes of fuel, I'm not going to make St. Thomas.
I briefed the crew that we will keep going to St. Croix, but we were going to set up for a possible ditching. It's dark, it's overcast, it's raining, and the sea is very angry. A lot of whitecaps, the swells were quite enormous, and I had heavy winds.
Captain DeWitt's years of experience are about to come into play. As he descends, he watches the 10 to 15-foot waves and chooses one, knowing full well he has to land on top of it rather than head into it, or the plane could break into pieces. Unlike U.S. Airways Flight 1549, which skimmed across the top of the Hudson River, this plane submerges before bobbing back up to the surface. Captain DeWitt says the plane continues to function while in the water.
The aircraft was rolling to the left and was in already a high degree bank, well beyond 30 to 35 degrees. All I did was start flying it like I would in the air, and it rolled out level, and the minute it rolled out level, I sort of popped to the surface just like a cork.
Not all have survived the impact, but those who do escape into shark-infested waters. It's an hour and a half before rescue helicopters begin arriving on the scene. Because the cockpit microphone for the PA system was not working, The pilot never had a chance to verbally warn passengers to put on their seatbelts or brace for impact. 40 of 63 survive. According to the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, fewer lives would have been lost had passengers received adequate warning. Of the 23 who don't make it, 2 are infants. To this day, it's difficult for the pilot to come to terms with the loss of life.
The story itself, not very difficult, except if I let my mind wander to the people I lost. Yeah. No, the 2 kids I lost back there.
The final NTSB report on ALM 980, issued nearly a year later in March 1971, reveals a long list of all that went wrong that day. It reads, "The probable cause of this accident was fuel exhaustion, which resulted from continued unsuccessful attempts to land at St. Martin until insufficient fuel remained to reach an alternative airport," and tells of another factor, reduced visibility, a condition not reported to the flight.
I think the biggest thing was that they kept thinking that they would make it, and they kept doing the planning and realizing increasingly that they weren't going to. The airplane, after its second approach into St. Martin, was fuel critical, and to allow a jet to get to be in that fuel critical a state is an error on the part of the crew.
There's one thing in this accident that cannot be taken away from me, and I will not let anybody take it away from me. That's the responsibility. I take that. I wore the 4 stripes. I made all the decisions. Somewhere along the line, I should have been sharp enough to know, regardless, to get myself into a situation like that. And to this day, I still haven't found where I could have done anything better.
The FAA revoked Captain DeWitt's pilot certificate 6 weeks after the ditching. He never flew as a pilot again. Next, terrorism in the skies and another dramatic ditching. This one caught on camera. When a commercial jet has to make an emergency landing, the hope is to find a nearby runway. But that's not always possible. Sometimes, in a dire situation, ditching a plane in a body of water is the only choice. These are the nail-biting stories of planes that had to do just that. Amazingly, what's often described as a terrifying life-or-death experience for passengers doesn't even seem to faze the men in the cockpit.
But there was no fear factor. I had no problems with the crew. Everybody was with me.
You know, we had things to do, and I think that makes a big difference. I've always felt that certainly the flight attendants and passengers from back would have had a lot more fear than us because they had nothing to do.
Water ditchings like those made by Flight 1549 and ALM 980 are rare, but there have been several more dramatic cases. In January 2002, a Boeing 737 operated by the airline Garuda Indonesia flies into severe thunderstorms, and both engines are lost. After 2 unsuccessful attempts to restart them, the pilot ditches in a shallow section of an Indonesian river. 59 of the 60 people on board survive. In August 2005, an ATR-72 turboprop fitted with the wrong fuel gauge runs out of fuel and ditches in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Sicily. 16 of 39 on board are killed. 7 airline employees, including mechanics, executives, the pilot and co-pilot, received prison sentences of up to 10 years. More than half a century ago, there was another ditching, and amazingly, the entire incident was caught on camera. The old Coast Guard film is startling, but it doesn't tell the whole story. This graphic animation shows what it might have looked like if you'd been in the middle of the Pacific Ocean on October the 16th, 1956, watching Pan Am Flight N90943 go down in open water. The images are eerily similar to US Airways Flight 1549, the so-called Miracle on the Hudson. But there are also some major differences.
It's open ocean, so it's going to be significantly more difficult than, say, a river, just because of the swells and so forth. The differences is that they had hours to plan this. The Hudson River crew only had a couple of minutes.
A Pan Am passenger flight leaves Honolulu, Hawaii, with 31 people on board and 44 crates of canaries in the cargo hold. Known as the Clipper Sovereign of the Skies, the Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, a long-range post-war airliner, is bound for San Francisco. This is footage of that actual flight, filmed by the Coast Guard. Joanne Marzioli is on board.
It was a month before my 3rd birthday. I was with my mother. We were returning to the Bay Area from the Philippines, and my mother was very anxious to get back to California to see my father.
But the reunion would be dramatically delayed. Several hours into the flight, far from land, the plane is climbing to 21,000 feet when one of its 4 engines begins to overspeed. Its normal hum now becoming a deafening scream. It's the middle of the night and pitch black over the Pacific.
They had a problem with the propeller, and they created so much drag that they were doing okay with it for a while, and then they ended up having another engine problem that the second engine couldn't sustain the high power. It would be an unbelievable set of circumstances.
2 engines that should be moving the plane forward are now holding it back. It's like driving a car with the handbrake on. The plane won't make it to San Francisco or back to Hawaii. The pilot, Captain Richard Ogg, quickly determines he has no choice but to ditch in the Pacific.
My mother mentioned that she didn't hear any yelling or screaming. She did hear a lot of praying in different languages. The mood was very, very serious.
The pilot radios a nearby Coast Guard cutter for assistance, and a plan is formed. The plane will circle above the ship for the rest of the night, lightening its fuel load and waiting for daybreak.
You want to be as light as you can, because with less weight you can go slower and fly it more slowly, so the impact with the water is going to be lessened. But also you want to do it with daylight, because it improves your depth perception. You're going to be able to put the airplane into the water with a better judgment of exactly how high above the water you are. And that's going to increase the likelihood of having survivors.
Despite a well-thought-out plan, it's an incredibly dangerous situation. Captain Ogg is remarkably calm, even managing to provide some comic relief, suggesting passengers light their cigarettes and relax.
I mean, here he is, he's in a situation where he's going to have to ditch the plane, and yet he's able to joke like that. He seems to me to be very calm and have his sensibilities about him, which, if you have to have a pilot who's going to ditch a plane, you'd want a pilot who has his senses about him.
The plane remains aloft for 3.5 hours, operating on 2 of its 4 engines. By daybreak, conditions are more conducive to ditching. The wind is calm, and the temperature is around 20 degrees Celsius. A Coast Guard camera records the scene from below as flight attendants prepare the passengers above, telling them to remove their shoes, tighten their seatbelts, put out their cigarettes, and put on their life jackets. The pilot has the crew move passengers away from the back of the cabin.
He was probably worried that the tail would break off, and if that was the case, then he wanted to make sure we were all safe in the front of the plane.
There's a 10-minute warning, a 1-minute warning, and then 3 simple words from the pilot. This is it. The plane splashes down at a speed of 104 miles per hour. The impact is brutal. The plane whips around, its tail snapping off just as the captain had feared. But neither the film nor the graphic animation can fully express what the people who were on that plane experienced at that moment.
When it hit the water, it jarred me apart from my mother, and I slid from under her legs and just slid under the chair. So that was very scary for my mother. I think that was the one time where she did let out a sound, where she did probably scream. Where's my child?
The Coast Guard crew is convinced no one could have survived this. But then, movement. Within the fuel in the process.
Visibility was poor, it was raining, and because of those conditions, he had to stay in closer to the airport and to the runway than he would normally have liked to have done. So the first attempt was unsuccessful.
That you were below minimums. I elected then to refile for San Martin, my original destination, which I did.
Contrary to the information Captain DeWitt says he was given, the weather is terrible. He attempts to land the plane anyway, burning massive quantities of...
The same conditions existed, however, by now the winds had shifted 180 degrees. Now he had a tailwind. Because he had a tailwind, he was too high on the approach.
So at that point, I told my crew, tell the tower I'm going to my alternate.
Calculations showed that they would make it just barely. They were legal by their calculations, but there wasn't much extra. In hindsight, it's easy to sit and say, well, they should have stopped in Bermuda or they should have stopped on the way down in San Juan. The moment that they missed the runway, it went from fuel.
So I lined it up with the runway and I took my second circular round.
Now on the second attempt, the winds were starting to shift and he was unable to line it up for a landing. So he decided to go around again. On the third attempt,